Hello and welcome to episode 3 in a series of videos I'm making covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. If you haven't watched my 2 previous videos, I'd recommend having a look at the hashtag HisTV YouTube channel. There are lots of video series made by lots of different teachers there, helping students continue their study of history at home. Today we're going to have a look at the key question, how did the position of women change in American society in the 1920s? And we're going to be thinking about one of the iconic images from the 1920s as well, and that is the image of the flapper. So we're going to be thinking about how the lives of women changed during the 1920s and how for some women, maybe things didn't change very much at all. Now, there are 4 key areas I'm going to be covering in this video, answering the question about the position of women and how it changed in American society in the 20s. We're going to start by looking at what the attitudes towards women were like before World War I, so pre-war attitudes. We're then going to have a look at some of the big social change that some women experienced during the 1920s, during a time that is commonly known to historians as the economic boom. We're going to have a look at the increasing action of women in the media. And then finally, we're going to have a look at how, for some women, old attitudes continued. Now, there's one piece of key terminology that I'm going to refer to that you may not have come across before, or you will have heard, but maybe don't understand the meaning fully. And that word is conservative. Now, if you're in the UK, you probably would have heard of the Conservative or Tory party in politics. And the name of that party really comes from this word conservative, which is to hold traditional values or ideas and to be against change. So when I'm talking about conservative values or conservative ideas, I mean ideas from people who want to hold on to their old traditional values and really stop change from taking place. More on that later. So in order for us to explore how the position of women changed in American society in the 20s, we need to know what attitudes were like before. So let's start with pre-war attitudes. So attitudes towards the women before the 1920s were generally very traditional and very conservative. And there were a series of expectations placed on American women at the time. They were expected to wear very plain, restrictive clothing that covered up the vast majority of their skin. They're expected to behave politely. They're expected not to wear makeup and appear quite plain. And if they wanted to go out to date a man or to meet a man, they need to be accompanied by a chaperone. And this was someone who usually would accompany them, usually an older woman, who would make sure that the behavior was polite and that nothing happened that shouldn't be happening. And they were expected not to smoke in public. So these are the series of expectations that were placed on American women before the 1920s. In terms of economic opportunities, well, middle and upper class women were expected to be a housewife. It was expected that the man in the relationship would go out to work and would be the breadwinner, providing for his family. But for middle and upper class women, they're expected to stay at home, to have children, and to ensure that the home life was well kept. There were very few paid jobs available for women before the 1920s, although during World War I, when many American men were away fighting, some women did start to work in the factories and industrial jobs. Now, for those women in poorer classes who were having to work, they generally had very low paid jobs. They worked as cleaners, they worked in dressmaking or secretarial work, so working as a secretary in an office. And they also had no right to vote. So they were denied access to America's political system because at the time, the conservative values believed that that was really for men. And so attitudes towards women were generally more conservative in rural and more religious areas. And we're going to see how that started to change during the 1920s. So we've covered the pre-war attitudes, those conservative traditional attitudes. We're now going to have a look at some of the social change that did happen for some women in the 1920s. It's really important to remember that these changes that we're talking about in the video were not experienced by all American women. So for some middle class urban women, urban means in the city, 1920s was a time of social change, increasing freedom and independence. And that starts in 1920, where women aged 21 or over were given the right to vote in all American states. Women now had some access to America's political system. Political parties had to think about women in their campaigns, making sure that women maybe bought into the things that they were promising. And so this begins a period of change for women. For young, middle-class urban women, many of these old traditions were abandoned. Women were able to wear more colourful and revealing clothing. They smoked and drank in public, and they went out with men without a chaperone. And the term flapper was used to describe independent and fashionable young women. In terms of work, women living in urban areas were able to work in new industries created by the economic boom. And this was particularly middle-class women. And so by 1929, there were 10 million working women, 24% more than there had been in 1920. So you can see from this slide here that for some women, they've experienced this social change, this increasing freedom, more independence. And that word flapper is used to describe the kind of the iconic look of a woman wearing a more revealing dress, colourful, different hairstyle perhaps, often dyed their hair jet black. So for some women, they experience these changes. Now, as a result of these social changes, women seem to appear more and more often in the media. If you've seen my previous video, you'll know that the radio industry and the movie industry grew massively in the 1920s. And so that's also reflected in the films and books and radio shows of the time. So let's start with novels and books. Novels started to give women role models to look up to. Scott Fitzgerald, very, very famous writer of the time, his book, This Side of Paradise, and then The Great Gatsby, cracking film if you haven't seen that, released just a few years ago. These books featured flapper culture, and they were inspired by his wife, Zelda, who also wrote quite a lot about the life of a flapper. So women had role models to look up to. Now, we know that the cinema became incredibly popular during the 1920s. Millions and millions of American people were going to the cinema each week. And so these women who went to the cinema saw films with female characters with modern style and attitudes in leading roles. The 1923 film Flaming Youth starred Colleen Moore, who became known for playing flappers on the big screen. And in newspapers and magazines, they also started to use women in terms of advertising. Newspapers and magazine owners found that sex appeal sold better than anything else, and so adverts often included women in revealing clothing, trying to appeal to men. And magazines also, like Life and Vanity Fair, featured women on the front covers wearing flapper style. So women and this new style of woman, the flapper, gained a lot of exposure in the 1920s. Now, we've talked a lot about some of the big social changes and how some of these conservative attitudes were beginning to change, but for a lot of American women, old attitudes did continue. Generally, for rural, countryside, working class and Black American women, they experienced very limited social change. Nothing really changed for them. Particularly in more religious, conservative rural areas, women did not experience social freedoms. And the traditional expectations that we talked about before of a woman's style and her behaviour continued. In terms of economic opportunities, women were paid less than men, even when they did the same job. And although from 1920 women did have the right to vote, political parties did not want women to stand for positions of power, and they described women as being unelectable. Now, for rural women, women living on farms, little changed, particularly those areas reliant on farming where women were mucking in and working alongside the men. Actually, very little change. They didn't have the time or the money to be going out experiencing these big parties that some of the flapper women living in urban areas were able to experience. So there we have it. One key thing to take away from this video is that for some women, particularly your middle and upper class women living in the cities, they experienced some big social change. But for many American women, these old conservative attitudes continued. Thanks for watching.